The Federal Reserve credit created during the last 8 months has not stimulated economic growth in technology or the industrial section, but a lot of it ended up in the expanding real estate bubble, churned by the $3.2 trillion of debt maintained by the GSEs, the government-sponsored agents, enterprises. The GSEs, made up of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the Federal Home Loan Bank, have managed to keep the housing market afloat, in contrast to the more logical slowdown in hotel and office construction. This spending through the GSEs has also served as a vehicle for consumption spending. This should be no surprise considering the special status of that the GSEs enjoy, since their implied line of credit to the U.S. Treasury keeps their interest rates artificially low. The Clinton administration encouraged growth in housing loans that were financed through this system. In addition, the Federal Reserve treats GSE securities with special consideration. Ever since the fall of 1999, the Fed has monetized GSE securities, just as if they were U.S. Treasury bills. This message has not been lost by foreign central banks, which took their cue from the Fed and now hold over $130 billion worth of United States GSE securities. The Fed holds only $20 billion worth, but the implication is clear. Not only will the Treasury loan to the GSEs if necessary, since the line of credit is already in place, but if necessary, Congress will surely accommodate with appropriations as well, just as they did during the savings and loan crisis of the 1970s. But the Fed has indicated to the world that the GSEs are equivalent to U.S. Treasury bills, and foreign central bankers have enthusiastically accommodated, sometimes by purchasing more than $10 billion worth of these securities in 1 week alone. They are merely recycling the dollars we so generously print and spend overseas. After the NASDAQ collapsed last year, the flow of funds into the real estate accelerated. The GSEs accommodated by borrowing without restraint to subsidize new mortgages, record sales, and refinancing. It's no wonder the price of houses are rising to record levels. Refinancing especially helped the consumers to continue spending even in a slowing economy. It isn't surprising for high credit card debt to be frequently rolled into second mortgages, since interest on mortgage debt has the additional advantage of being tax deductible. When financial conditions warrant, leaving financial instruments such as paper assets and looking for hard assets such as houses is commonplace and is not a new phenomenon. Instead of the newly inflated money being directed toward the stock market, it now finds its way into the rapidly expanding real estate bubble. This too will burst, as all bubbles do. The Fed, the Congress, or even foreign investors can't prevent the collapse of this bubble, any more than the incestuous Japanese banks were able to keep the Japanese miracle of the 1980s going forever. Concerned Federal Reserve economists are struggling to understand how the wealth effect of the stock market and real estate bubbles affect economic activity and consumer spending. It should be no mystery, but it would be too much to expect the Fed to look to itself and its monetary policy for an explanation and assume responsibility for engineering the entire financial mess we're in. A major problem still remains. Ultimately, the market determines all values, including all currencies. With the current direction of the dollar certainly downward, the day of reckoning is fast approaching. A weak dollar will prompt dumping of GSE securities before Treasuries, despite the Treasuries and the Fed's attempt to equate them with government securities. This will threaten the whole GSE system of finance because the challenge to the dollar and the GSEs will hit just when the housing market turns down and defaults rise. Also, a major accident can occur in the derivatives market where Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are deeply involved in hedging their interest rate bets. Rising interest rates that are inherent with a weak currency will worsen the crisis. The weakening dollar will usher in an age of challenge to the whole worldwide financial system. The dollar has been the linchpin of economic activity, and a severe downturn in its value will not go unnoticed and will compound the already weakening economies of the world. More monetary inflation, even if it's a concerted worldwide effort, cannot solve the approaching crisis. The coming crisis will result from fiat money and monetary inflation. More of the same cannot be the solution. Pseudo-free trade, managed poorly and driven by fiat money, is no substitute for free trade, a true free trade, in a world with a stable commodity currency such as gold. Managed trade and fiat money historically have led to trade wars, which the international planners pretend to abhor. Yet the trade war is already gearing up. The WTO, purported to exist to lower tariffs, is actually the agency that grants permission for tariffs to be applied when complaints of dumping are levied. We are in the midst of a banana, textile, steel, lumber, and tax war, all managed by the WTO. When cheap imports hit our market, it's a good deal for our consumer. But our manufacturers are the first to demand permission to place protective tariffs on imports. If this is already occurring in an economy that has been doing quite well, one can imagine how strong the protectionist sentiments will be in a worldwide slowdown. Congress is starting to realize that the budget forecast based on an overly optimistic growth rate of 3% is way off target, and even the pseudo-surpluses are soon to be eliminated. Remember, the national debt never went down with the so-called surpluses. The national debt is currently rising at more than $120 billion at an annualized rate and is destined to get worse. Our dollar problem, which affects our financial and budgetary decisions, originated at the Fed with our country's acceptance of paper money 30 years ago. Federal Reserve officials and other government leaders purposely continue to mislead the people by spouting the nonsense that there is no evidence of inflation as measured by government-rigged price indices. Even though significant price increases need not exist for monetary inflation to place a hardship on the economy, stock prices, housing prices, cost of medical care and education, and the cost of government have all been rising at very rapid rates. But the true inflation, measured by the money supply, is rising at a rate greater than 20% as measured by MZM. This fact is ignored. The deception regarding price increases is supported to reassure us and may do so for a while. The Fed never admits it, and the Congress disregards it out of ignorance, but the serious harm done by artificially low interest rates leading to the malinvestment, overcapacity, excessive debt, and speculation are the distortions that always guarantees the next recession. Serious problems lie ahead. If the Fed continues with the same monetary policy of perpetual inflation, and the Congress responds with more spending and regulations, real solutions will be indefinitely delayed. The current problems hopefully will cause us as a nation, and in particular Congress, to reassess the policies that have allowed the imbalances to develop over these last 30 years. Someday, stable money, based on the gold standard, must be reconsidered. Stable money is a constitutional responsibility of Congress. The Federal Reserve Board's goal of stable prices, economic growth, and low interest rates through centralized economic planning by manipulating money and credit is a concoction of the 20th century Keynesian economists. These efforts are not authorized by the Constitution and are economically detrimental. Economic adjustments wouldn't be so bad, as many wild recessions have proven, except that wealth is inexorably and unfairly transferred from the middle class and the poor to the rich. Job losses and the rising cost of living hurt some more than others. If, of course, this is not changed, the entire middle class prosperity can be endangered, as has happened all too often in other societies that pursued a false belief that paper money could be satisfactorily managed. Even the serious economic problems generated even generated by a flawed monetary system could be tolerated except for the inevitable loss of personal liberty that accompanies government effort to centrally plan the economy through a paper monetary system and the ever-growing welfare state. Likewise, an imperialistic foreign policy can only be supported by inflation and high taxation. This policy compounds the threat to liberty because all too often our leaders get us involved in overseas military adventurism in which we should have no part. Today, that danger is greater than ever as we send our dollars and our troops hither and yon to areas of the world most Americans have no knowledge or interest in. But the driving force behind our foreign policy comes from our oil corporations, international banking interests, and the military-industrial complex, which have high-stakes interest in the places our troops and foreign aid are sent. If, heaven forbid, the economy sinks as low and for as long as many free market economists believe, what policy changes must we consider? Certainly, the number one change ought to be to reject the ideas that created the crisis. But rejecting old ways that Congress and the people are addicted to is not easy. Many people believe that government programs are free. The clamor for low interest rates, more monetary inflation, by virtually all public officials and prominent business and banking leaders is endless. And the expectation for government to do something for every economic malady, even if ill-advised government policy had created the problem in the first place, drives this seductive system of centralized planning that ultimately undermines prosperity. A realization that we cannot continue our old ways may well be upon us, and the inflating, taxing, regulating, and the centralized planning programs of the last 30 years must come to an end. Only reining in the welfare warfare state will suffice. This eliminates the need for the Fed to monetize the debt that politicians depend on to please their constituents and secure their re-election. We must reject our obsession with policing the world by our endless foreign commitments and entanglements. This would reduce the need for greater expenditures while enhancing our national security. It would also remove pressure on the Federal Reserve to continue a flawed monetary policy of monetizing endless government debt. But we must also reject the notion that one man, Alan Greenspan, or any other chairman of the Federal Reserve, can know what the proper money supply and the proper interest rates ought to be. Only the market can determine that. This must happen if we ever expect to avoid continuous and deeper recessions and to get the economy growing in a healthy and sustainable fashion. It also must happen if we want to preserve free market capitalism and personal liberty. The longer the delay in establishing a free market and a commodity currency, even with interrupted blips of growth, the more unstable the economy and the more difficult the task becomes. Instead, it will result in what no one wants: more poverty and political turmoil. There are no other options. If we hope to remain a free and prosperous nation, economic and monetary meddling undermines its principles of a free society. A free society and sound money maximize production and minimize poverty. The responsibility of Congress is clear. Avoid the meddling so ingrained in our system and assume the responsibility, all but forgotten, to maintain a free society while making the dollar once again as good as gold. Now, I want to close with a quote from James Madison from the Federalist Papers, because the founders of this country faced the dilemma of runaway inflation with the continental currency, and that is where our slogan comes from: it's not worth a continental. And this was a major reason why we had the Constitutional Convention, because they knew and understood the evils and the disastrous effects of what paper money could do to a society. And these are the words of James Madison. He says, "The extension of the prohibition to the bills of credit must give pleasure to every citizen in proportion to his love of justice and his knowledge of the true springs of public prosperity. The loss which America has sustained since the peace from the pestilent effects of paper money on the necessary confidence between man and man, on the necessary confidence in the public councils, on the industries and morals of the people, and on the character of the Republican government, constitutes an enormous debt against the states chargeable with this ill-advised measure. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Iowa.
Wish to now present the address of the House.
Without objection.